Hello, and welcome to another episode of Interactions, a podcast about law and religion and how they interact in the world around us. I'm Anna Knudsen.
And I'm Ethan Anthony.
And for this two-part episode, we had the pleasure of speaking to Peter Wozniak and Daniel LaChance about two death row cases relevant to law and religion.
In this first episode of 2, we want to talk about prisoners on death row and the RIGHT, right to death. The right, if there is one, for death row inmates to have a say in deciding the way in which they die. For this, we're going to be looking at the case of Michael Nance, a death row inmate who requested death by firing squad in the state of Georgia. By current law, death row inmates are allowed to contest the means of execution, which currently is by lethal injection.
But to do so, they have to come up with the alternative means of execution themselves. We'll be getting into relevant cases like Glossip v. Gross, how retributive justice unfolds in American prisons, and discussing the ethics of what happens when the burden falls on the prisoner to decide the way they die. In our second episode, we're going to talk about the RITE, right to death, the religious rites and rituals that accompany death made particularly salient in death row cases. For this, we'll be looking at the case of Ramirez v. Collier.
In this case, John Ramirez, a Texas death row inmate, requested that he be permitted to have his pastor present at his execution and to pray over him and lay hands on him. But Texas denied the request, and the case went to the Supreme Court. The question became whether Texas' denial represented a violation of the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment and a violation of our LUPA. In this interview, we asked the question, what rights do religious inmates have on death row? You're listening to Interactions, and this is The Right to Death. Daniel LaChance is a legal scholar working at the intersection of American legal and cultural history, criminology, and literary studies. He came to Emory as an Andrew W. Mellon Faculty Fellow in Law and the Humanities. His first book, Executing Freedom, The Cultural Life of Capital Punishment in the United States, won a Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award from the American Library Association. His second book, Crimesploitation, was released in May 2022. Co-authored with Paul Kaplan, the book explores reality television depictions of crime and punishment, from cops to Dog the Bounty Hunter, and their place in American culture. This is our interview with Daniel LaChance.
So to start off, can you talk to me a bit about Michael Nance's case? What is the nature of the request that he's making?
Right. So Mr. Nance is a capital defendant who has been sentenced to death and is on death row in Georgia. And he has requested, given the kind of recent challenges with lethal injection executions, he has claimed and wants to be executed by a different method of execution. And so the Supreme Court has ruled in some prior precedents over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a bunch of challenges to the constitutionality of lethal injection. And the Supreme Court has upheld the legality of lethal injection as a method of execution. It has said that it is not cruel and unusual, but it has acknowledged to some extent the problems that have accompanied lethal injections and has essentially created a doctrine that says you're not entitled to a painless execution.
Was this Alito who said you're not entitled to a painless execution?
I believe so, yeah. I believe it was Alito, or the majority in that decision that, he might have been writing for in Glossip. Yeah. But the... essentially, the court's doctrine is you're not entitled to a painless execution, but if you can point to another readily available method that the state can use to put you to death that is substantially less likely to cause unnecessary pain, then you may have a case.
So why is it the prisoner's job to decide, decide the alternative means of execution? Why is that his burden, and not the state's?
Well, I think partly because the court. I mean, there's kind of these sociological reasons, right? Which is the court has become more conservative over time. So the kinds of justices that are sitting on the court that would be, say, open to that would see these kinds of things as perverse,
right.
and would be open to sort of thinking about painful executions as inherently unconstitutional. They're just not there, right? So politically, the court has shifted rightward over time, and so there's just not a majority that is willing to give a lot of wiggle room to folks coming forward and challenging the constitutionality of death sentences. And so, yes, I think to folks that are against the death penalty, who see it as an evil, there's an extra layer here of a perversion of saying to a defendant, you need to pick which way to die if you don't want to be put to death by this particular method of execution, and you need to, the burden is on you to then, concoct an alternative and to prove that it's less likely to go wrong, or it's less likely to inflict undue or unnecessary pain, and that it is superior to lethal injection.
And it is quite perverse, like as you say. He's not requesting not to be executed. Like that's not what's like under like discussion here. He's just requesting a different way of dying, like maybe a more painless death, maybe a more dignified death. Is that kind of like the pattern that we're seeing in recent court cases dealing with injection?
I mean, I would say, it's perverse depending on your perspective, right? So for folks that are, and I think for some of the justices who believe in the morality of the death penalty as well as its constitutionality, what they would say is these offenders didn't give their victims options on how to die, right? They inflicted very painful, gratuitously, all murder is gratuitous, right? But they in many cases it inflicted extreme pain. And so the very fact that the state regulates pain is giving them something that they didn't give to their own victims, right? So it really is, it does depend on your perspective about the morality of the death penalty, right? And if you think of this as a retributive kind of punishment, there's a way in which you could make the argument that, from one point of view, it's perverse to say choose which way to die, right? It's torturous. It's a form of psychological torture. But from another perspective, one that sort of is really thinking a lot about the harm that's being recompensed via the execution. This is a way of making the violence of execution qualitatively different from the lawless violence that execution is punishing, right? So that being able to say, we want to minimize pain, we are going to shift the burden to you on how to do that. We think this execution method is does not violate the Constitution, in terms of inflicting gratuitous pain. But if you can point to something that is better, then the burden is on you to do that.
Now, Michael Nance has requested firing squad, and if we're talking about punitive eye for eye justice, why are people uncomfortable with that?
I mean, that's a great question. Yep. So the history of methods of execution in the United States is the big pattern that historians see in it. It's a history of what I call dark optimism, right? Dark in the sense is that we're talking about how to kill people. Optimistic in the sense of having this kind of persistent faith that the development of technology and the development of human sensibilities is leading us to find methods of execution that are going to be quicker and more painless than our older methods of execution. So hanging was the modal form of capital punishment until New York State did the first execution by electricity in 1890 on a man named William Kemmler. And at that moment, right, there was this real outcry over the history of how barbarous hangings were. Sometimes, if the rope was too long, the victim would be decapitated. At other times, if the rope wasn't long enough, the neck wouldn't break and they would strangle to death. It was hard to look at, right? You'd see a body that was, swinging and struggling, and it took a long time, right? You look at newspaper accounts, anywhere from 12 to sometimes 26, 28 minutes of a person dangling there, to ensure that they were dead. And so, electricity had this promise of instantaneous death with no sensation of feeling, right? That all of these folks who were, electricity was relatively new, or humans' ability to control it was relatively new. And there was this kind of real real sort of almost utopian sense that we could get rid of the sort of pain and the lingering death of hanging with this very quick, surefire, easy death by electrocution. And of course, that's not what happened, right? Kemmler's execution went terribly awry, right?
Yeah.
He, by all accounts, the body was smoking. He wasn't dead after the first round of electricity went through him. The witnesses fled the chamber because it was so disgusting to watch, right? It was all, if you look at the headlines covering Kemmler's execution, they were, they said things like worse than being burned alive, right?
Yeah.
So there's this, and so we see, the development of yet more new versions of it to replace electricity. That takes, many decades. A lot of states hold on to electricity, but other states opt to develop what they think will be a more superior method than hanging or electrocution. And so in the 1920s, you have the first execution in Nevada via gas chamber, right? But of course, we know that those executions have had a history of being botched, right?
Yeah.
And so again, it's this history of Americans looking at executions that make them really uncomfortable,
Right.
and then instead of saying there's no way to kill a person in that is quick and painless,
Right.
instead saying no, we just haven't found this holy grail that we're going to continue to look for. Right. So lethal injection, when it first emerged and was first used by the state of Texas in the early 1980s, was that it was this new notion that this would be like putting an animal down, right, at the pound, where you just put them to sleep.
Yeah.
And what we found is, or what the claims folks have made is, it's not that simple, right? Sometimes prisoners have histories of IV drug use that make it very difficult to get a vein, right? So twice in the state of Ohio, men have been strapped to the gurney and they've been poked and prodded for 2 to 3 hours in an effort to find a vein, and then the execution team was forced to give up, and the execution was called off. Because you have to have 2 lines to ensure there's a fail-safe backup mechanism, and sometimes they couldn't even find one line, right? You have Oklahoma, where Clayton Lockett was executed in what was a horrifying 45-minute event where they couldn't find a vein, and so they went in through his groin, and they didn't quite establish the line, and the drugs appeared to have gone into the tissue rather than into the bloodstream, right?
Yeah.
And then, the device slipped out, but nobody saw it because he had been covered up because they wanted to try to provide what they said was dignity to him to not have his, genitals exposed to the witnesses. So again, there's this time after time after time, there is this pattern of having this confidence in the face of failure that we can get this right.
Yeah.
So some historians have really argued that even though the rhetoric is about being more humane and it's about it's about creating making it as easy as possible on the person undergoing the execution and honoring their dignity, that really what this has all been about is not ensuring that the person who's being executed is getting as painless an execution as possible, but instead making it easier for those who carry out the witness and those who watch the execution. Yes, that this is about cosmetics. That the history of execution reform is less about, caring for the pain that the condemned may or may not experience and trying to minimize it. It's really been about cosmetic purposes. So back to your question about why is the court,
iffy on the firing squad, right?
Right.
That's what Michael Nance is requesting, and it's quite shocking to hear someone wants to die by firing squad.
Yes.
But it's the same thing. He's being put to death.
Right.
So feel different.
Exactly. So the firing squad has a comparatively much better record than any other mode of execution. It's very hard to find in the historical record botched firing squad executions, but because it is bloody, because it is riddling someone with multiple bullets, and there's a lot of blood,
Yeah.
And then somebody has to clean up that blood, and witnesses have to see that blood. There's no getting around that blood.
Right.
There's a way in which we have backed away from the firing squad, not because it doesn't meet the requirements of being quick.
It's hard to look at.
It's hard to look at, right? So that history of, if you see the history of execution reform as driven by cosmetic concerns rather than concerns for morality and the desire to inflict the least amount of pain possible, you can tell a story that this is really not about giving the condemned person the most painless execution possible. It's about managing the emotions and the emotional response of those that have to carry out the death sentence and those who witness it.
And so these cycles you're talking about, there seems to be this resurgence of people requesting firing squad deaths. There was Utah 2010, I believe. There was South Carolina recently, and now there's Michael Nance. Are we seeing this resurgence of just violent deaths in response to this aesthetic concern? Like, what does it mean for a prisoner to request this, this death by firing squad, this very bloody death? What are courts going to do with that request?
Yeah, I mean, my hunch is that the states don't really want to put people to death this way.
Yeah.
And, some of these state legislatures, like South Carolina, have created this as a backup option.
They might have had the electric chair as well. I saw that.
Okay, was that?
They have multiple fail-safes. Like, they still allow electric chair. I want to check that. But.
Yeah, fact check me on this, but some states have put back into play the electric chair, but also firing squad.
It's crazy.
So it's hard for me to imagine courts, striking down the firing squad as being cruel and unusual punishment.
Because there's no evidence? Because they're not botched in the same way?
Those would be very good, sort of rationales, what you just said. And also because I don't think legally there's this sort of question of like when law is being decided, right? There's the subtext and then there's the text. Okay. And I don't think textually you're ever going to see the Supreme Court say these executions just look bloody and that's and that's gross, right? And that violates the Eighth Amendment violation on cruel and unusual punishment. Because cruelty, I think they know they're supposed to read cruelty as the cruelty of what the person who's receiving the punishment experiences, rather than some kind of like perceived cruelty, right? That the people watching it, I don't think you would see, courts go there. Although who knows, right? Antonin Scalia, who was this famous originalist, who was a staunch supporter of the death penalty and defender of its constitutionality. Even he admitted that some of the things that we tolerated in the 18th century, like ear cropping, right, where somebody who would be punished by having a section of their ear cut off, or branding, that probably wouldn't pass, Eighth Amendment muster. And the question is, again, comes down to, it's hard to know what the court, we know there are a lot of variables that impinge on justices' decision making, but those variables aren't always legible in the decisions that they write, right? So I could imagine a lot of these justices or folks deciding the constitutionality of the death penalty who don't like bloody executions. And maybe they don't like it at a certain point, to the point where they're like, this would be an embarrassment to have this kind of an execution on a regular basis in the United States. And so they'll find some other rationale to, that goes beyond the cosmetic.
This is the subtext you're talking about?
The subtext would be, I don't like the image of people being burned alive or being, shot to death and bleeding all over the place. But the text isn't going to be about cosmetics. Right. There is language about the evolving standards of decency in a society, in society that you can point to in the Eighth Amendment, and maybe they could talk about cosmetics, but I don't know that they would, because it looks sort of callous to say this. We really need to care about the optics and not the actual pain that someone is experiencing during an execution.
Would it be possible that, like, in their effort to advance like an optical, like an aesthetic death, they would somehow cut back on the prisoner's autonomy to decide their own way of dying? Like, in the name of aesthetics, or like subtextually in the name of aesthetics, we might see the prisoner's right to decide their execution be lessened. Because right now what's striking to me is just the fact that you as the prisoner, it's your job to find an alternative means of death.
Right.
The state isn't going to come in and look for that proactively.
I think there's a lot going on here. To answer your question, do I think that they're going to roll back, if defendants come up and say, we want this really gruesome method, I want to be beheaded, right? That would be a good example, right? I think being beheaded is a lot more humane than what you're doing to me. Or they want to sort of force the prison officials and the wider world to confront what an execution is, which is a body mutilating form of violence. Right? There's no, the violence, it's always, the body is always mutilated. It's just how legible that mutilation is to onlookers, right? And so if you could imagine some inmates having a political desire to be put to death in a way that is legible, where
Does that become a free
violence
speech
becomes
concern?
I
know
mean,
that's a crazy leap, but kind of my question is, like, if you
Right.
wanted your death to be a statement as a death row inmate, do they have some sort of constitutional protection to say, I would like the public to know that I'm being executed? I know that people often will read last words of death row inmates. I've seen compilations online where you can just go and see what they are. It's rather macabre, but to make a statement, is there some sort of free speech protection that these prisoners have as well?
You can't control the state's operation in carrying out a death sentence, and say that you have a right to die, the way that you are being put to death is a form of expression, because it's not your expression. It's the state, administering a punishment. So I think it would be a very big stretch to sort of, imagine that someone could say, I have a First Amendment right to die in a way such that my death communicates what I want to communicate about it, because
that's kind of the limits.
If it's an expressive act, it's the state that's making the expression, right? And so what I actually think with these cases is that Georgia is fighting Mr. Nance's efforts to try to dictate the terms of his execution, right?
Are they fighting it because they want to not seem as bloody?
I think there's probably a lot of different reasons. I think one of the reasons why they're fighting it is they don't want inmates having power over the operations of their prisons and their criminal justice system. That, they don't want to go into court and litigate, every different defendant's idea about how you can put me to death the most humanely. And so that's why they are, really doing procedural, maneuvers to try to stop inmates from taking advantage of the recent rights they have gained, under cases that were decided about lethal injection, to offer alternatives. They want to make it as impossible for inmates to prevail on this. I don't think it has anything to do with them wanting to control the cosmetics of the execution. I think it has everything to do with them wanting to say, we get to run our show the way we want to run our show. And you don't get to dictate to us anything about what happens to you, right? That's not how this works. This is punishment.
Right.
And so there's an emotional dimension there, but I think there's also a logistical one, which is they don't want, on a bureaucratic level, it costs time and money to give everybody, these alternative modes of execution and to litigate, all these. And I think some of them cynically see these condemned men and women as trying to buy more time by just prolonging these appeals and using anything they can to have to live longer.
Right.
But I also think that there's a real sense of, we don't want to have to put all of the time, energy, and resources into creating and executing all of these alternatives.
Right.
We want to put people to death the way we know how to put people to death, which is by lethal injection, and we don't want anyone telling us how to run our death chambers.
Right. Now, you bring up that people have questioned the sincerity based on how long someone wants to live. I remember you saying that the time spent on death row is an average of 17 years now. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the death penalty, when it was revived in the 1970s, was imagined by its supporters as this antidote to a justice system that they saw as ridden with technicalities that often let inmates, people who committed crime, from ever seeing justice. But even when they were sentenced to prison, there was this sense that prison was too soft, it was too rehabilitation oriented, and that it was a revolving door, and people would go in who had done something terrible, and then they would be out again in 3 or 4 years, and they would do something terrible to someone else. And there was this real sense that a kind of liberal approach to punishment was creating a revolving door prison system and a justice system in which defendants had all the rights and the victims of crime had none. And in that moment, the death penalty came to be seen as a symbol of the opposite of a liberal, permissive, soft approach to criminal justice, right? It brought about finality, right? It brought about a sense of security. This person will never kill again or will never harm someone again. And it seemed like an act of moral clarity. It was a way of saying punishment shouldn't be about helping you get your act together. Punishment should be about inflicting pain to give you your just desserts for having harmed other people. So the state that was punishing with rehabilitative prison and short sentences was seen as not really punishing. Right. And the death penalty really was this unequivocal act of holding people responsible and punishing them and giving them what their actions were worth in terms of, an eye for an eye, right? A lex talionis approach to justice. So, this is all to say that, when we think about time spent on death row, in the 1970s, or in the 1950s, from the before the 1970s, right, when the Supreme Court had this hot moment when it temporarily suspended executions, and there were no executions for about 10 years while issues with the constitutionality of the death penalty were being resolved. In the decades leading up to the 70s, the average time between sentencing and execution was less than 2 years.
Wow.
The closer you get to the 19th century, we're talking months rather than years. So in the 70s, it seemed like the death penalty would be this thing that was a fast, swift, painful, punitive response to crime that would give justice to the victims of crime and their families and would keep people safe, right? Because that person could never harm anyone again.
Right.
But what ended up happening is, because federal courts, after all of these constitutional remedies were implemented in the 1970s, federal courts began to more heavily supervise everything about how states carried out their death penalty systems within their criminal justice systems. And so as a result of, there's many different reasons why appeals take so long. And I won't get into them because really the point I want to make is, because of much greater federal supervision of executions, we've seen over time the average time between execution move from what it was before the 70s to 17 years on average. Wow. But also the vast majority of people who are sentenced to death aren't executed. So we've had over 15,000 people sentenced to death in the United States since 1976. And we've had about 15 to 1,600 executions.
Wow.
So the vast majority of people who are sentenced to death either haven't made it yet to the execution chamber, or their cases were overturned on appeal, or they're still waiting, right?
Right.
And so inmates have tried and failed to argue that because they're living under this sentence of death for so long, that amounts to a form of psychological torture, right? That having to live every day of your life knowing that the state is going to execute you, and carrying that sort of mental stress is an unconstitutional, violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, because you could say it's both, right? It's
Yeah.
unusual in the sense that historically executions didn't take this long to happen,
Right.
and then cruel in the sense that it's a form of psychological torture. But historically, Americans have been much less likely to acknowledge psychological pain as a form of punishment or as part of the experience of punishment.
Do you think we're going to see a shift in that with like conversations around psychological pain, mental health? Do you see that these
Yeah.
are we going to see a possible shift maybe? For
Not
better
with
or
this
for
court.
worse? Not
I mean,
with
if
this
if
court.
you're thinking about like at the higher levels, no, right? Not with the Supreme Court. With potentially at the lower court level, but it doesn't really. If it has legs and it's making radical changes, it's not going to get very far. So, for instance, a federal district judge in California ruled the California death penalty unconstitutional because, on average in California, the average time between sentencing and execution had risen to 25 years.
Oh, wow.
And when he wrote this decision, nobody had been, I think it was like in 2000, oh gosh, I don't want to say because I'll get the dates wrong, but it was within the last 5 to 6 years when he wrote this decision. Nobody had been executed in California since like 2005.
Wow.
So, and California has the largest death row in the country with over 700 people on it. So you have all these people in solitary confinement, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Nobody's been executed in over a decade. And these people are all living with the sentence of death when this case reaches the court. And you have this, you have this federal district court judge who probably values the things that you were just mentioning about, yes, like psychological pain is pain, and this pain is not incidental to the punishment. It is clearly something the state has the ability to control inflicting, and yet it does. And therefore, and all these other, you can read the decision, but the court says, look, the California doesn't have a death penalty. It has, essentially in California, you are sentenced to life without parole with the remote possibility of death. That's what it's actually happening here if we like name what's happening honestly.
Yeah.
And so he struck it down. He said this is unconstitutional because it takes too long.
Now in the case of California, it struck down the death penalty. Could you see this going the other way where someone says it's taking too long and then the court says, great, let's execute you faster, let's expedite it? Because I see it like, I hope that this argument is strong enough so that maybe anti-death penalty legislation like takes hold. But I could also see someone saying, great, let's make it a faster turnaround. Right.
Yeah. So I think the thing is, that judge's decision didn't stand. Right.
Oh, it didn't stand.
No. Right. That's the point that I'm making is that these federal judges, right? There's 3 levels. There's the district court judge, and that's who overturned the California death penalty and said it was unconstitutional. The Ninth Circuit, which is a relatively liberal circuit, was like, no. Right? Like, this will never pass muster, given what the Supreme Court has said in the history of litigating, claims about the psychological harms of incarceration. This decision will not stand. And if it goes up to the Supreme Court, they'll overturn it, so we're going to overturn it because we just know that this is too radical of a decision that doesn't have any kind of that won't survive, moving up through the federal appellate system. So California goes back to having the death penalty, right? Yeah. But then we know, right? We've got a governor in there who, Gavin Newsom, who has essentially suspended execution. So there's other things that have happened in California, but still the death penalty is on the books, and you still have people on death row, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
So, but your point about what are the effects of what would the likely effects be if the court somehow did, which it never will, say that this psychological pain, I should say, never will under its current configuration at the top levels. What would happen if they said, yeah, psychological pain is a real thing? Well, yeah, you could imagine states saying, let's expedite these executions, but it's really hard to do that, in part because of the layers of due process that people are entitled to. So in the 90s, people were complaining about how long it was taking to put people to death, right? It had crept up to about 10 years on average. And they, in the mid-90s, Congress passed legislation called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which changed the game for capital punishment appeals. It made it much harder for you to get on the habeas level of review, right? Which is after you've gone through, there was something wrong with my trial, and you're making kind of other kinds of claims about why you shouldn't be put to death at the state and then federal level. There was this perception that inmates were gummying up the system with frivolous appeals. And so their rights to bring new claims, that they hadn't, that were outside of the claims from their, state and federal appeals were dramatically shrunk by the courts. And everyone said, look, we've put all this legislation into play that's going to make it harder and harder for inmates to even bring claims in front of the court and have their claims heard. That's going to really speed up these executions. And it didn't. Part of the issue is money, right? States don't want to pay for good defense attorneys for the poor people that are charged with capital crimes. And so egregiously incompetent defenses happen in a lot of states that use the death penalty the most, right? Lawyers who sleep through parts of the trial, lawyers who never bring a witness in defense, lawyers who don't cross-examine, right? And so the rates that the states offer attorneys to try these cases are so pitiful that few people are taking them. That's especially the case in California. No one wants to do this work because the state can't, isn't willing to allocate money to do it. And so as a result of this, the flaws in these trials are so egregious, right? That even conservative pro-death penalty appellate judges are saying, no, this can't stand, right? And sending these cases back to be retried, which starts the process again.
Because it varies so widely from state to state, like based on like the district attorney. Like there's just this level of chance involved.
Yep, that's another part of the puzzle, right? That like some counties in Texas have not had a death penalty trial since the 70s, right? And then the county that Houston's in, Harris County, if it were a state, it's had so many death penalty trials that the number of people who've been executed who committed crimes in that one county is equivalent to is larger than the total amount of executions from any single state except Texas. So more people have been executed from this one county in Texas than the entire state of Oklahoma, than the entire state of Virginia, than the entire state of Georgia since the 1970s, right? So the DA has a lot of power and discretion over when to seek the death penalty. And so you're right, there's an unevenness across all of these different places. But generally the kind of common denominator, which has nothing to do with who the DA is how good is the representation that death row inmates or potential death row inmates, right? People charged with capital crimes for the prosecutors seeking the death penalty. How good are the free lawyers that the state is providing for them? And if you want good lawyers, you got to pay for them. And a lot of these states, nobody wants their tax dollars to go to defending murderers, right?
Yeah.
So you just end up having, there's a lot of great defense attorneys, right? My dad was a criminal defense attorney, so I'm not knocking criminal defense attorneys, but what I'm saying is these are the cases that people that, have a lot of experience and a lot of brain power and a lot of, a lot of knowledge are the least likely to take because they don't want to take them. There's no incentive financially to take them.
And so the clock just keeps running.
Exactly.
People just stay longer and longer on death row.
But then at the appeal stage, right, after these people have been sentenced to death and they've gone through appeals, that's often when you see pro bono big New York firms coming in and doing as part of their pro bono work, throwing all of these like heavy hitter guns at the situation, right, and finding, a whole new set of really legitimate things that again make it really so there's really not an easy way to get back to your original question to speed up executions,
right?
Simply because of the economics in these states and the way budgets work, but also just as a matter of we've settled on the fact that we give people due process, and that we're going to review it at different levels, which we didn't do before the 70s very often.
Right.
And so there's only so much. There's going to be limits to how much you can speed up executions.
And so these prisoners are just going to have that psychological torture every day on death row for who knows how long.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But you know what the prosecutors say when prisoners bring these cases and say this is psychological torture? The prosecutors say, well, then drop your appeals, right? And a good chunk of executions in the United States are people who did precisely that. They're called volunteers. But these are people that decided they don't want to live in an 8x10 box waiting to die. They just want to get it over with.
Wow.
And they drop all of their appeals. So, there's a kind of, again, thinking about the perspective of people who support the death penalty. For them, it's you don't get to have your cake and eat it too. You can't have all the benefits of getting, really close inspection of your case and making sure all the T's were crossed and I's were dotted, and then say that that's torturing you, right? That you are perverting and saying that too much justice is a form of psychological torture. And they're saying that's an incoherent argument, right? And beyond that, they're saying, we all know what you're doing here. You're stalling. You're stalling for more time, and then claiming that, and so we've given you more time to answer every single one of your questions, right? And then you're telling us that it's too late, that you've been on death row for too long, and you've been under too much psychological pain, right? So I think some folks, right, on the left are very much able to still look at this and say, this is ridiculous, right? This is a form of psychological torture, and everyone deserves justice, but they shouldn't have to wait on death row for 17 years to be executed and to have to live every day with that hanging over their head.
Right.
But folks that support the death penalty say, look, if you want justice and due process, you can't then say that that's torturing you.
Now, what about people who are anti-death penalty? I remember when you were writing your amicus briefing with other people that there were signatories who didn't want to sign because, in some sense, that if you're signing on to have a more just death, are you kind of also supporting the death penalty?
Right. Well, there were people that raised that concern on the amicus brief, but they ultimately signed because there was a footnote put in, sort of disclaiming that folks that are signing this brief are not ceding the question on, whether the death penalty is, is constitutional or is, et cetera, et cetera. What they're saying is, look, if you're in a no-win position, we want these defendants to have as much agency as they possibly can.
If Michael Nance is going to be executed.
Yes, he should have the right to present the state of Georgia with an alternative sort of thing. But I'm sorry, what was your question there?
My question is just, it's still hard to try to find more just ways to die if you're not in support of the death penalty as it is.
Absolutely.
But you're forced to try to find these alternative ways of dying.
Yep.
And it seems to be that there is no great way of dying. We've kind of seen that with all of these botched executions with lethal injection.
Yeah, it's true, and it's I agree with you that it seems odd for someone to fight for the right to choose a different way to die. On the other hand, I don't know Mr. Nance's interior motivations. I know the legal arguments that he's making, but for me, whatever his internal motivation is, whether it's I want people to see how bloody an execution is, and to stop making it cosmetically pretty. I want people to be forced and confronted with the violence that they are inflicting on anyone they put to death, including me. Or whether it's, I really don't want to be gasping for air and being unable to communicate because I've been paralyzed, or having this lingering death and not being able to, I don't want that torturous execution that I've been told can sometimes happen with lethal injections, and I want a death that's going to be really quick and painless, and maybe not painless, but over with. I don't want all of these unpredictable things. I don't want to have to sit there tied down while they try to establish IV lines, right? I just want someone to shoot me and get it over with, right? Whatever it is for him, right? These are bad. This is a choice amongst all bad options for someone who does not want to be put to death. But whatever his motivations may be, right? I think those of us who signed on to this brief strongly believe that he should be able to die with as little pain and as much dignity as possible.
That's part 1 of our 2-part series, The Rite to Death, with Daniel LaChance. Thank you for listening.
Canopy Forum and the Interactions podcast are distributed by the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and produced by Anna Knutson and Ethan Anthony.
You can follow Canopy Forum on Twitter or Facebook, follow Interactions on Instagram, and subscribe to Interactions on your favorite podcast platform.